Hello, hope your day is going well. Before we get to the message, I'd like to give a quick plug to one of the exciting things that continues to go on in our church building, even though we are not worshiping in the sanctuary. If you have tuned in previous weeks, you've begun to learn that we are not only a church that meets on Sundays, we are also a community center of sorts where several different entities and institutions house their businesses or their school or their exercise class or their karate studio. We're lots of different things, and we are proud of what goes on here in our building, as it's somewhat of a landmark in this community, the Meridian Kessler neighborhood. 3 weeks ago, I gave a plug for the food pantry, and I would like to do it again because in the recent few weeks, we have noticed a discernible uptick in the volume of people, of clients who are coming through to collect food. As you are, I'm sure, well aware, we are in a time of pandemic and economic hardship and disparity, and there is a great need for food. Well, duh, you need it to survive. And there are many who are without, and in recent weeks we have noticed quite an uptick. And by the time you are seeing this, we will have gone through another Saturday, and I'll be able to, in the next video, hopefully report still more families coming through. This last Saturday, we had 31 different family units. Of those 31 units, more than 10 had 5 or more people. So if you do the math, we're feeding well over 100 people. And this is why we need your continued support, not only to continue to be good landlords for the different communities who are a part of our Northwood community, 2 other churches that meet here, and all of the others, the preschool and things that I've named, but also to carry on with this ministry that we have kept up throughout the course of this pandemic. We did have to take a few weeks hiatus when a volunteer had come into contact with somebody who had COVID, but since then we've been doing a curbside service, and it is just getting more efficient, and we are helping more and more people and new people, making new friends with neighbors that we had not yet met. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can go on our website, www.ndncc.org, and there's a link to that there. Or you can reach out to us through the contact information that is now showing on your screen. Or you can donate in the link that is just below the video in the description. So without further ado, on with this week's message. Before we read today's scripture reading and dive into the message, I will have 2 things that I want to say. First is you will probably almost certainly hear the sound of children playing in the background. I'm recording this on a Thursday morning and into the afternoon on a school day, and our building here at Northwood Christian Church houses 2 schools, and they spend most of their time outside during this time of pandemic for safety reasons, and so I'm sorry if it is a bit of a distraction. As for me personally, I like to hear the sound of children playing. It makes me feel good, makes me feel happy. It reminds me of my own childhood, and so I apologize if it's a distraction to you, or maybe you can hear it over my speaking and take some sort of joy in the sound of their play. The second thing that I want to say is that today's scripture reading is a lengthy one. It tells the story of the first Passover, and then tells how Moses commands the people by way of God's instructions to continue to remember this night every year going forward, telling the story to the children. And so it being a lengthy passage, I give you a pass if you have trouble following along. Try your best, and I hope by the time we get to the discussion, the importance and significance of this iconic text will become clearer, and its relevance for today will become clearer. And so, without further ado, here goes. Today's text is from the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 through 13, and then picking up in chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. And it reads, "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, 'This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now moving on to chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. The Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine. Moses said to the people, remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your children on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. There you have it. Exodus's account of the first Passover meal. We'd do well to note just where the Israelites find themselves on this first Passover. They find themselves entrenched in and beholden to a system of death. This is a place where they are slaves in Egypt, where they have brick quotas to meet that they cannot possibly meet. They are beaten on their backs. Their lives are bitter. Their children are murdered by the Pharaoh. All of this to shore up Egypt's economy. Egypt was the empire of its day, made immeasurably wealthy by way of war-making, conquest, enslaving peoples, forced labor, and all of this held together by the wealthy, keeping the system humming along by feeding the laborers just enough. This points us towards deep human psychology here. Why would you put up with something like this? The threshold between poverty and death. Why would you stay right there? Well, the threshold between poverty and death does keep those on the cusp just alive, but immobilized. So we rationalize, I may be deep in debt and on the edge, but if I fight it, I might find myself in an even more precarious position, so I fight it. For the Israelites in Exodus, fighting it meant death. But God sees the suffering and hears the cries of the people. We can read about that in the 3rd chapter, verse 7. And God intervenes and liberates. Today, and in the story, there is a moment that breaks in. Hope against hope, a prophecy of a kind that calls the people's holy imagination to envision a time beyond Egypt, transcendent of Egypt. This takes some real imagining to envision a future, an economy, a community outside of the one that these generations of Israelites have known for perhaps hundreds of years. They have only known Egypt. What is there besides Egypt? It is the entire world from their perspective. All they know is that they are tired and unhappy, but then again, this is all they know. Their children can't expect more of the same. Why should they wish for any more for their children than they have discovered for themselves. Generation by generation, nothing new under the sun. More of the same. But then a prophet rolls into town, Moses, and then actually his brother Aaron too shows up, and their message upsets the Pharaoh, to put it mildly. He questions the primacy of Egypt, this fundamental assumption about Egypt's primacy. Now keep in mind, to Pharaoh, Egypt is all there is as well, but in a different sense, because he is sitting at the top. To the Egyptians, Egypt was everything, as timeless and as enormous as the pyramids that we can still see in Giza, and as confident and as proud as the smiling Sphinx which guarded the heritage of the kings of old. This is a proud people whose king was thought to be divine and whose rule was thought to be divinely sanctioned. God made it this way. In other words, the gods made it this way. And we've seen similar things throughout history. This religious, idolatrous nationalism that arguably is still with us today. Moses comes into town and says in so many words, the God who is God wants to set these captives free. Not a happy message for Pharaoh sitting at the top. Today's text is about a transitional period, about the night before it happened, and then what the elders would tell their children about this time in the future. This transition between captivity to freedom. So first there's this meal. Its contents, how it's prepared, how it's to be eaten, when it's to be eaten, and how the Israelites are to dress even whilst they eat it. And all of this is laden in symbolism, and I'd like to move through the details of this meal going forward in the next few moments. God's dialogue with Moses and Aaron begins with more than a hint of a paradigm shift. It begins with, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." In short, this is a new beginning for you and your people. Going forward, this will be January 1, the beginning of a new year. In other words, a new era, new hopes, new possibilities. Things are not going to be the same going forward. This is a rebirth, or for us disciples, a baptism into a new life. And I'm sure the people were made anxious by this pronouncement. After all, change is hard. Sure, Egypt was hard. Life there was hard, but it was, as I keep harping on about, the only life they had known. Familiar, comfortable, even if it is unpleasant. Then they are told to take a lamb. And if the household cannot afford a lamb, connect them with a family that can. Or if several families can't afford a lamb, they pool their resources and they share. Here you have in real time a different ethic developing. It's as if to say, in Egypt, you went it alone. You survived alone. You cared for you and yours alone. Going forward, the health of the community will be found in your ability to care for those who can't even afford a lamb for one meal. This new way would be essential to Israel's survival in the wilderness going forward, as they would discover again and again their need for one another and for the community. This also pushes against our own assumptions about rugged individualism, this idea that's in the ethos that we are each an island, autonomous and not beholden to one another in any way. But then there's the timing and the ritual of the meal. Anathea Portier-Young writes of this: the lamb's slaughter takes place at twilight, literally between the evenings. It is the hour of transition between day and night, a time of ending and beginning. The lamb's blood upon the doorposts of the Israelites' houses similarly marks transition. These houses are not their permanent dwellings. They provide short-term protection, but their most important feature is the doorway, site of entry and exit. The lifeblood of the lamb marks that exit, protecting, hallowing, and preparing their departure from slavery in Egypt. So the people are about to enter a completely new and better reality, but they don't know it yet. They're just being told to be ready for it. And I wonder if this sitting on the cusp between slavery and liberation was disorienting for some. I wonder if the liberation itself was disorienting for some. I mean, as I keep saying, slavery was all that they knew. Moving on. They are to cook the meal without any real strategy. Not medium rare, not slow cooked over the course of the day, not boiled or stewed. It is to be seared over a fire. And as somebody who cannot really cook but can grill, I get it. Place it over heat and wait until it's done, and quickly. This is a meal prepared in haste, prepared in expectation for something to happen soon. So you had better shove it down and eat it quickly. And so they're instructed to eat all of it and then burn what they cannot finish. So here again we have the beginnings of a different ethic, a new economy. In Egypt, or the Egypt that we meet in Exodus, and I feel I must say that because it is a portrayal that is very unflattering to Egypt, and it's more nuanced and complicated as it always is. And I do love Egypt, and I love studying Egypt, so I feel the need to say it ain't all bad. But the Egypt that we meet in the book of Exodus, hoarded and prepared for every contingency. Grain bins were full while people starved. The people's minds were shaped to see scarcity in the midst of abundance, and the rich were afraid of losing it all. But in the face of conventional wisdom, the Israelites are told to eat enough for the day and no more, and then trust that God will keep them going forward. And in the wilderness, they would be tested, but God's faithfulness would be experienced again and again and again. Sometimes water from a rock or manna in the morning. This is a very different mindset than ours today. We too, like the Israelites in Egypt, might worry about having enough. Generosity suffers and anxiety drives the greed of a nation, of many individuals or churches. So they sit down to eat a meal. Actually, I can't tell if they're meant to be sitting down or standing up. They're meant to be fully dressed, shoes on, walking stick in hand, and loins girded. It's a funny phrase, and I must confess I was not absolutely sure what it meant, although I gathered something of what it meant from the context. But I looked it up, and basically it's what happens when you are poised and ready for action at a moment's notice. Your legs are like loaded springs ready to launch you forward. It's like the Israelites are meant to be eating this meal as if they are sprinters awaiting the pistol shot before the start of a race. And then they're off. And what does the pistol shot signify here? Liberation, freedom, and an end of Egypt's dominance in their lives, an end to Egypt's exploitative ways, Egypt's entrancing economy, and all that was wrong with its idolatrous ways. So moving forward, that night, it happens. Now, I must note that it happens at the expense of the innocent, of Egypt's firstborn sons, and even the firstborn of the animals. And that's how this story goes, and it's troubled a few readers through the centuries, and it troubles me in no small amount. And it's difficult what to make of this, except to say this was a different time, I think, that assumed an ethics of violence and vengeance. And did violence meted out by the divine really need to occur? I certainly hope not. And while this might have seemed like justice from the Israelites' perspective, let's allow ourselves to, in this story, mourn for the Egyptian mothers, just as we mourn for the Israelite mothers whose children were killed by the Pharaoh at the beginning of the story, at the beginning of Exodus. And this all seems so true of life: death begetting death, begetting death, begetting death, and on it goes. We see it today. And one of the things that the Israelites would discover moving forward was the cost of not leaving death-dealing ways behind. They would many times take life and pay for it. Perhaps that is a part of the point. We do the same. After the 13th verse of chapter 12, the narrative lectionary leaps forward to chapter 13. And here we have Moses instructing the people as how they are to remember the first Passover. More specifically, how they are to talk about this to their children. And they're meant to reenact this meal every year. It's to become ritualized. And this reenactment is meant to teach the children what it is like to sit on the cusp of amazing, unbelievable, and startling, surprising, unexpected liberation. Perhaps children in the future will find themselves in bondage yet again. Spoiler alert, they did. And they will eat this meal and hope against hope that their liberation is but a sunrise away. In fact, in many ways, this describes the history of Israel, a conquered people again and again, occupied and dominated by Assyria, by Babylon, by Persia, by the Greeks, and then in Jesus' time, the Romans, the same old story. Same kinds of oppressors, same exploitative economies that sought out extravagance for the powerful at the expense of the poor. Imagine what it might have been like to have been a Jewish child hearing your elder tell this story of liberation yet again and thinking, if God could do it once, well, maybe God will do it again for me. And this thought becomes in time intuitive to the child. And then as an adult, she cannot throw off this lens of hope through which she has been taught to see the world. And so she is ready for it, expecting it, and it will not pass her by when it comes. If only this were true of our children today. What will we tell our children of these times? We seem to be on the cusp of what? Something. But many of us worry that we are on the cusp of whatever freedom's opposite is. And there is a deep-seated pessimism and hopelessness in the air. It's palpable. That seems to be the hallmark of our times. Can you feel it? I am sure that you can. And if this describes you, please toy with the idea of allowing the freedom prophesied for God's people to give you hope. Perhaps this too, this moment in history is a new beginning. The end of something that should die and the beginning of something wonderful for the people God is striving to liberate. Perhaps what is about to break in is a taste of God's realm. It's what God's people should always be hoping. These passages call us to a radical hope. Imagine it. If we readied ourselves for something amazing. I mean, I've heard it was done before. I've read the stories of liberation in the Bible. I've read the journal entries and writings of heroes of the faith who persevered against everything, against all odds. I've read of the radical hope of Frederick Douglass that he found somehow in the midst of despair and deep-rooted pessimism. I've read the 13th Psalm where the psalmist begins, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" But then concludes in a surprising twist, "But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." So what will we tell our children? I think a lot of that depends on what we believe in the present moment. Is God sufficient to lead us to where we need to go? And if so, we, like the Israelites, must be willing to leave a lot behind. We must leave behind the rampant consumerism that drives many of our decisions. We must leave behind the death-dealing ways of war that promise peace on the other side, but lead us instead to the valley of death's shadow again and again and again, as history has shown us and as we still do not learn today. We must leave behind the allures of comfort and security at the expense of those made poor by an economy that values profit margins over life-giving, sustainable communities. And boy, don't we know it in 2020 during this pandemic, as the economic anxieties and fragilities of our communities and our families are laid bare for all to see. It was always there, and now it's amplified. I hope we will tell our children that we were ready for God's realm to break in, that we were able to leave Egypt behind in the dust. So, yes, gird your loins. Get ready for it. God is faithful. Eat with your shoes on. Hope against hope that on the eve of apparent calamity, we can have confidence that the sun rises in the morning, that Egypt and all empires fade to history and all that they signify, but that the land to which God leads us is life everlasting. Tell your children to be ready for it. Find rituals and ways of teaching of your own to help them to intuitively see the world through this lens of hope. Hope for new possibilities and new beginnings and new life. Help the people today imagine new beginnings bigger than what is promised by our economists, our celebrities, and our politicians. In the meantime, allow the ethics of Passover, its sharing, its generosity, its expectancy that God will provide for us going forward to change your outlook in the here and now. God is alive in the world, striving towards the liberation of all peoples, even the ones you don't like. Will we live to see it? Either way, be ready for it. Perhaps the words of Moses to the people will one day be true of us if our children should ask us why we remember and tell the stories of the liberations we may witness, we hope to witness in our time. Maybe we will say something like, "You shall tell your children on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt."